The sky above Valoria Prime had turned black with enemy ships. Ambassador Talos stood at the great window of the council hall, watching the massive Keth warships drift across the stars like dark clouds blocking the sun. 300 ships. 300 instruments of death, each one larger than any vessel the Valorians had ever built. The blockade had been in place for 7 days now, and with each passing hour, hope grew thinner. The Valorians were not warriors. They had never been warriors. For thousands of years, they had been scholars and traders, building their civilization on knowledge and peaceful exchange. Their ships carried goods and ideas, not weapons. When the Keth Dominion arrived with demands of complete surrender, the Valorians had nothing to fight back with. Talos turned away from the window and looked at the communication screens lining the wall. Each screen showed a different face, representatives from dozens of species across the Galactic Council. He had spent the last week begging each of them for help. The responses were all the same. The Tyranni expressed deep sympathy, but explained that their fleet was committed elsewhere. The Mechari offered medical supplies, but no military support. The Voss simply said that engaging the Keth would be suicide and wished the Valorians well in their negotiations. One by one, every species found a reason to stay away. "They are afraid," said a quiet voice behind him. Talos turned to see Myra, a young communications officer, standing near her station. She was barely past her first century, young by Valorian standards, but her eyes held a sadness that made her seem much older. "Of course they are afraid," Talos replied. "The Keth have never lost a war. They have conquered 17 species in the last 200 cycles. No one wants to be number 18. So, they will watch us die instead." Talos had no answer for that. He returned his gaze to the window, to the endless field of enemy ships hanging in the void. In 3 days, the Keth had promised they would begin their bombardment. The Valorians could surrender and become slaves, or they could resist and become ash. Those were the only choices. The great cities of Valoria Prime were already emptying. Millions of people fled to underground shelters that everyone knew would not survive a sustained attack. Children were crying. Parents were praying to gods they had stopped believing in centuries ago. The entire planet held its breath, waiting for an end that seemed unavoidable. Mira sat at her station, monitoring the communication channels out of habit more than hope. Most of the frequencies were silent now. The council had said everything it planned to say. The Keth broadcast their demands on a loop. There was nothing else. But then, something caught her attention. A faint signal, barely visible against the background noise of space. It was coming from the outer edge of the system, far beyond the Keth blockade. Myra adjusted her instruments, trying to get a clearer reading. The signal was weak, almost too weak to detect, but it was definitely there. She ran the signature through her database. The result made her freeze. Human. A human patrol ship was passing through the outer system. Probably just traveling through on its way to somewhere else. Completely unaware of what was happening on Valoria Prime, humans were the youngest species in the galaxy. Barely a century since they had discovered faster-than-light travel. Most council members considered them primitives, clever primitives, perhaps, but still far behind the ancient civilizations that dominated galactic politics. Myra had never met a human. She had heard stories, of course. Everyone had heard stories. Humans were aggressive, emotional, and lived such short lives that other species found it difficult to take them seriously. What could a creature that lived for only 80 or 90 cycles possibly understand about the universe? But right now, that human ship was the only vessel in the entire sector that was not part of the Keth fleet. Myra looked at Ambassador Talos, who was still staring out the window at the enemy armada. She thought about all the species that had refused to help. All the ancient, wise, powerful civilizations that had calculated the odds and decided the Valorians were not worth saving. She made a decision. Her fingers moved across the controls, opening a channel to the human ship. The signal would be weak, and there was no guarantee it would be received. But she had to try. Someone had to try. "This is Valoria Prime," she said into the microphone, her voice shaking slightly. "We are under siege. The Keth Dominion has blockaded our world. We have 3 days before they begin their attack. Please, we are dying. Anyone who can hear this, please help us." She sent the message and waited far away at the edge of the system. A small human frigate called the Steadfast was making its way through empty space. Captain Kang Do-hin was in his cabin, reviewing navigation charts for the next leg of their patrol route. It was supposed to be a quiet assignment, just a routine sweep through a few uninhabited systems before returning to base. His communications officer knocked on the door and entered with a strange expression on her face. "Captain, we have received a distress signal. It is coming from Valoria Prime." Do-hin frowned. "Valoria Prime? That is Valorian territory. What is happening there?" "According to the signal, the Keth Dominion has placed the planet under siege. 300 ships. They are asking for help." The captain was silent for a long moment. 300 Keth warships. His frigate had a crew of 40 and enough firepower to maybe, on a good day, take on 2 or 3 enemy vessels of similar size. Going anywhere near that blockade would be suicide. He had no orders to engage, no authority to start a conflict with a major galactic power, no backup within a dozen light years. Every logical calculation said he should continue on his patrol and report the situation to Earth Command. But Kang Do-hin had not joined the fleet because of logic. He stood up. "Set a course for Valoria Prime," he said, "and send a message to Earth Command. Tell them someone is asking for help." The Steadfast changed direction and began moving toward the distant planet, where millions waited to die. Someone had answered. The message from Captain Kang Do-hin traveled across the stars at faster than light speed, bouncing from relay station to relay station until it reached Earth. It arrived during the middle of a Galactic Council diplomatic summit, where representatives from dozens of species had gathered to discuss trade agreements and border disputes. Fleet Admiral Park Soo-jin was attending the summit as humanity's military representative. She was a woman in her early 60s, with gray hair cut short and eyes that had seen too much death. 30 years ago, she had been a young officer during the Martian Uprising, a brutal civil war that had nearly destroyed Earth's colonies. She had watched friends die. She had made impossible choices. She had rebuilt what others thought could not be rebuilt. When Captain Do-hin's message appeared on her personal device, she read it twice. Then she stood up from her seat at the conference table and walked out of the room without explanation. The other admirals watched her leave with confusion. The Tyranny Admiral leaned over to his aide and whispered something about humans and their strange behavior. The Mechari representative simply shook her head. Admiral Park found a quiet room and opened a secure channel to Earth Command. Within minutes, she was speaking directly to the commanders of every human fleet in the sector. She explained the situation quickly. Valoria Prime under siege, 300 Keth ships, millions of innocent people about to die, and one small frigate that had decided to answer a distress call. "Admiral," said one of the commanders, "the Keth have never been defeated in open battle. Our entire 7th Fleet has only 87 ships. Even if we mobilize immediately, we would be outnumbered more than 3 to 1. "I am aware of the numbers," Park replied. "The Council has already decided not to intervene. If we go in alone, we could be starting a war that humanity cannot win." "I am aware of that as well." There was silence on the channel. Everyone was waiting for her to make a decision. "Admiral." Park thought about Captain Do-hin out there in his tiny frigate, heading toward certain death because someone had asked for help. She thought about the Valorians, who had done nothing wrong except be too peaceful to defend themselves. She thought about all the ancient civilizations that had calculated the odds and decided it was not their problem. "Mobilize the 7th Fleet," she said. "Full combat readiness. We leave in 6 hours." The orders went out across the human territories. Ships that had been resting in dock began powering up their engines. Crews that had been on shore leave were recalled immediately. Engineers who had planned to go home to their families instead reported to their stations and began preparing weapon systems for battle. Among them was Lieutenant Yunhajin, a young tactical officer aboard the destroyer Relentless. She had graduated from the Fleet Academy 5 years ago, at the top of her class in combat strategy, but she had never seen real combat. None of them had. Humanity's wars had always been with themselves: civil conflicts, colony disputes, internal struggles. They had never faced an external enemy of this magnitude. When the mobilization order came through, Hajin felt a strange mix of fear and something she could not quite name. Perhaps it was purpose. For years, she had trained for battles that never came. Now, finally, everything she had learned would be put to the test. Admiral Park returned to the Council Summit one last time. She walked back into the conference room, where the other species representatives were still discussing trade routes and shipping regulations as if nothing had happened. They looked up at her with mild curiosity. "Admiral Park," said the Tyranny chairman, "is everything in order? You left rather suddenly." Park stood at the center of the room and looked at each face in turn. The Tyranny, with their delicate features and long lifespans. The Macquarie, wrapped in their environmental suits. The Voss, ancient and proud. All of them had refused to help the Valorians. All of them had decided that 300 Keth ships were too many to fight. "I am leaving," she said simply. "Humanity will be responding to the Valorian distress signal." The room fell silent. The Tyranny chairman blinked his large eyes several times before speaking. "Admiral, that would be most unwise. The Keth Dominion is not an enemy to be taken lightly. Your species is young. Your fleet is small. If you engage them, you will lose." "Perhaps," Park said, "you would throw away human lives for a species that is not even allied with you? The Valorians are not your responsibility. Someone called for help. That makes them our responsibility." The Macquarie representative leaned forward. "Admiral, please understand. We have the deepest sympathy for the Valorian people. But the Keth have conquered 17 civilizations. Some of those civilizations were older than humanity's recorded history. What makes you think you can succeed?" Where they failed. Admiral Park was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was calm and steady. "You have spent a century watching us," she said, "studying us, calling us primitive, violent, short-sighted. You look at our short lives and wonder how we can possibly understand the universe the way you do. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps we are everything you say we are." She took a step toward the door. "But we also remember something your ancient civilizations seem to have forgotten. When someone is drowning, you do not calculate the odds. You do not weigh the costs and benefits. You do not wait for a committee to make a decision." She looked back at them one final time. "You jump in." Then she walked out. 6 hours later, the 7th Fleet began its journey toward Valoria Prime. 87 ships carrying thousands of human beings who had decided that mathematics was not the only way to measure what was right. Behind them, the Council watched in silence. Ahead of them, 300 Keth warships waited dot, and somewhere in between, a single frigate called the Steadfast was still flying toward the enemy, refusing to turn back. Overlord Veth stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Dominion's Wrath, watching the stars with cold satisfaction. The siege of Valoria Prime was proceeding exactly as planned. In 2 days, the bombardment would begin. In 3 days, The planet would belong to the Keth Dominion. Another civilization would fall. Another world would be added to the empire. When his scouts reported the approach of a small human fleet, Veth felt something close to amusement. He had heard of humans, of course. Everyone in the galaxy had heard of humans. They were the newest species to achieve faster-than-light travel, barely a century old in galactic terms. They bred quickly, died quickly, and apparently thought quickly as well, too quickly. Perhaps to realize when they were making a terrible mistake. How many ships? Veth asked his tactical officer. 87, Overlord. A mix of destroyers, cruisers, and one battleship. Veth made a sound that might have been laughter. 87 ships against 300. These humans are either fools or they have a death wish. Should we adjust our formation to intercept them? No. Maintain the blockade. Let them come to us. When they arrive, we will crush them as a demonstration to the rest of the galaxy. Any species that thinks of challenging the Dominion will remember what happened to the humans. The Keth officers nodded in agreement. This would not be a battle. It would be an execution. What Overlord Veth did not understand, what he could not understand, was how humans fought. The Keth had evolved as apex predators on their homeworld. They were strong, intelligent, and utterly ruthless. Their military doctrine was based on overwhelming force and calculated strikes. They always ensured numerical superiority before engaging. They always chose battles they knew they could win. This strategy had made them the most feared power in their region of space. For over 1,000 years, humans had evolved differently. Their homeworld had been a place of constant struggle, not just against nature, but against each other. Humans had spent most of their history fighting wars. They had developed weapons, strategies, and tactics through endless conflict. They had learned to fight when outnumbered. They had learned to fight when outmatched. They had learned that sometimes the side that refuses to give up can defeat the side that should logically win. The Seventh Fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Valoria system. At its head was the battleship Unbroken Dawn, commanded by Vice Admiral Cho Yoonji. She was 38 years old, the youngest flag officer in human fleet history. Her reputation was built on tactical creativity that her superiors sometimes called brilliant and sometimes called insane. She had won war games that everyone said were unwinnable. Now she would find out if real war was the same. From the bridge of the Unbroken Dawn, Admiral Cho looked at the tactical display. 300 red dots representing Keth ships. 87 blue dots representing her fleet. The numbers were not in her favor. They had never been in her favor. She opened a channel to all ships. This is Admiral Cho. In a few minutes, we will be engaging the Keth Dominion in open combat. I will not lie to you. The odds are against us. Many of us will not survive this day. But I want you to remember something. She paused, looking at the faces of her bridge crew. Young men and women who had trained for years and were about to face real death for the first time. Those people down on Valoria Prime called for help. They did not call for the tyranny. They did not call for the Mechari. They did not call for any of the ancient, powerful civilizations that fill this galaxy. They called for anyone who would listen. And we listened. That is who we are. That is what it means to be human. We do not abandon people who need us. Across the fleet, thousands of crew members heard her words. Some were afraid. Some were excited. All of them were ready. All ships, Admiral Cho commanded. Full acceleration. Attack formation Delta. We are going straight through the center. The Seventh Fleet began to move. On the Dominion's wrath, Overlord Veth watched the human ships approaching with growing confusion. They were not spreading out to flank. They were not trying to find a weak point in the blockade. They were simply charging directly at the center of his formation. At full speed. What are they doing? he demanded. His tactical officer had no answer. This made no sense. No fleet attacked a superior force head-on. It was suicide. There had to be a trick, a hidden strategy, something he was not seeing. They must be planning a flanking maneuver, Beth decided. Shift the outer wings inward to catch them when they break formation. The Keth ships began to move, repositioning to counter a maneuver that the humans had never planned. The unbroken dawn kept coming. Vice Admiral Cho watched the enemy formation shift and allowed herself a small smile. The Keth were trying to predict her strategy. They were looking for logic, for calculation, for the kind of careful planning that their own military doctrine demanded. They did not understand that her strategy was very simple. Hit them so hard and so fast that they would not have time to think. All ships, prepare for combat, she said. Fire at will on my mark. The distance between the fleets closed rapidly. 200,000 kilometers. 100,000. 50,000. Mark. The 7th Fleet opened fire. Space lit up with weapons fire as 87 human ships unleashed everything they had at the center of the Keth formation. The first Keth vessels in the line were caught off guard, expecting the humans to break away at the last moment. They did not break away. The unbroken dawn plunged into the enemy formation like a blade through flesh. Around it, human ships followed, each one fighting with a fury that the Keth had never seen before. The Battle of Valoria Prime had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same. The battle turned into chaos within minutes. Human ships were smaller than Keth vessels and carried less armor. Their technology was younger, their weapons less powerful. By every measure that the galaxy used to determine military strength, they should have been destroyed quickly. But the Keth had never faced an enemy like this. The frigate Iron Promise lost its main engines to a direct hit early in the battle. The ship began drifting, unable to maneuver, a sitting target for the Keth guns. Its captain, Lee Sunwoo, had two choices: order his crew to abandon ship and hope for rescue, or continue fighting until the end. Captain Lee looked at his bridge crew. They were young, most of them on their first real deployment. They were scared, but none of them were running. Navigation, he said calmly. Plot a collision course with that carrier. He pointed to a massive Keth ship directly ahead of them. Engineering, overload the reactor on my command. His first officer's eyes went wide. Captain, I know what it will do. Lee's voice was steady. Any crew who wish to evacuate, report to the escape pods now. No one will think less of you. No one moved. The Iron Promise, using its remaining maneuvering thrusters, turned toward the Keth carrier and accelerated. The carrier's guns opened fire, tearing chunks from the frigate's hull. Still it came. The Keth crew aboard the carrier realized what was happening too late to move out of the way. The Iron Promise crashed directly into the carrier's hangar bay. A moment later, its reactor went critical. The explosion took both ships. Across the battlefield, other human ships saw the Iron Promise's final act. Instead of breaking their spirits, it set them on fire. They fought harder. They pushed deeper into the enemy formation. They refused to give up. The cruiser Horizon's Edge found itself surrounded by 3 Keth destroyers. Its captain ordered all available power to weapons and began trading fire with all 3 ships simultaneously. The cruiser's shields failed. Its hull was breached in multiple places. Still, it kept shooting. Then the Keth sent boarding parties. Chief Petty Officer Bay Yuna was in charge of the Marine detachment aboard the Horizon's Edge. She had 16 Marines under her command. When sensors detected Keth soldiers cutting through the hull, she gathered her people and headed for the breach points. They met the enemy in the corridors. Keth soldiers were larger and stronger than humans. Their armor was better. Their weapons were more advanced. 200 of them poured into the ship. expecting to overwhelm the defenders and take the bridge. Bayuna and her 16 Marines met them in the narrow hallways where size and numbers mattered less than determination. The fighting was brutal. Humans fell. Keth fell. The corridors filled with smoke and the sound of weapons fire. Yuna took a wound to her left arm but kept shooting with her right. She watched Marines she had trained die beside her. She kept fighting. For 47 minutes, 16 humans held off 200 Keth. When reinforcements finally arrived, a posthumous boarding party from a nearby human ship, only 3 Marines were still standing. Bayuna was one of them. The deck around them was covered with Keth bodies. The horizon's edge did not fall. On Valoria Prime, Ambassador Talis and Communications Officer Myra watched the battle through orbital sensors. The images were chaotic, full of explosions and debris. It was difficult to tell who was winning. "They are dying for us," Talis whispered. "Why would they do this? We are nothing to them." Myra did not answer. She could not take her eyes off the screen. Every few seconds, another human ship broke apart or went dark. Each one represented hundreds of lives lost. Each one represented people who had chosen to come here, to this place, to fight for strangers. She had sent the distress call. She had been the one to ask for help. Now humans were dying because of her message. But as she watched, she noticed something else. The Keth formation was breaking. The carefully organized blockade that had surrounded Valoria Prime was falling into disorder. Keth ships were colliding with each other as they tried to respond to human attacks coming from unexpected directions. The humans were not just fighting. They were winning. Vice Admiral Cho Yunji stood on the bridge of the Unbroken Dawn, coordinating the battle with a calm voice that hid the adrenaline pumping through her veins. Her tactical display showed the enemy formation fragmenting. The center line had been broken. Keth captains, who had never faced real resistance before, were panicking. "Push through," she ordered. "All ships, exploit the gaps. Do not let them reform." Lieutenant Yoon Ha-jin, aboard the destroyer Relentless, executed the order with precision she had only practiced in simulations. Her ship weaved through the chaos, targeting Keth vessels that had lost formation and were vulnerable. Around her, other human ships did the same. The tide was turning on the Dominion's wrath. Overlord Veth watched his tactical display with growing disbelief. This was impossible. 87 ships could not defeat 300. The mathematics did not allow it. Yet there it was, happening before his eyes. His fleet was falling apart. The humans were not fighting like any enemy he had ever faced. They did not care about losses. They did not retreat when damaged. They kept coming, kept attacking, kept dying, and kept killing. A direct hit shook the Dominion's wrath. Alarms began screaming across the bridge. "Overlord," his tactical officer said, voice trembling, "our center line has collapsed. Multiple ships are requesting permission to withdraw." Veth stared at the screen, at the small blue dots that had torn through his fleet like fire through dry grass dot. He had underestimated them. Everyone had underestimated them. "Order full retreat," he said quietly. "All ships, disengage and fall back." The Keth Dominion had been defeated. The retreat of the Keth Dominion began as an organized withdrawal and quickly became a rout. Keth ships that had spent years conquering other species now fled in panic from a fleet a third their size. Some ships jumped to hyperspace without waiting for the rest of their formation. Others collided with each other in their desperation to escape. The carefully maintained discipline of the Dominion's navy dissolved in hours. The human fleet did not pursue. They had won, but the cost had been terrible. Of the 87 ships that had entered the battle, 31 were destroyed. Another 20 were so badly damaged they could barely maintain life support. Thousands of human beings had died in the fighting. The debris field around Valoria Prime was filled with wreckage from both fleets. drifting slowly through the void. Admiral Park Sujin arrived with the Second Fleet 6 hours after the battle ended. They had traveled as fast as their engines could carry them, but they were too late to join the fighting. Now they could only help with rescue operations and repairs. Park stood on the bridge of her flagship, looking at the aftermath through the main view screen. Broken ships, scattered wreckage, bodies floating in space. The price of victory was measured in lives. Her communications officer reported an incoming signal. It was Captain Kang Do-hyun from the frigate Steadfast, the tiny ship that had been first to respond to the Valorian distress call. Against all odds, the Steadfast had survived. It was damaged, barely functional, but it was still there. Admiral. Do-hyun's voice came through the speakers, tired but steady. The Steadfast reporting. We held the line. Park closed her eyes for a moment. Yes, Captain. You did. On Valoria Prime, the people emerged from their shelters and looked up at a sky that was no longer filled with enemy ships. Ambassador Tallis stood in the ruins of the council hall, which had taken damage during the battle. Beside him, Mira was crying quietly. They had been saved. Against all logic, against all expectation, they had been saved by the species that everyone called primitive. The species that lived such short lives. The species that nobody had taken seriously. Within days, news of the Battle of Valoria Prime spread across the galaxy. The Galactic Council called an emergency session. Representatives from every major species gathered to discuss what had happened and what it meant. Ambassador Tallis requested permission to address the assembly. He stood before the holographic images of 1,000 star systems, his voice carrying to every corner of the galaxy. For 200 cycles, the Valorians have been faithful members of this council, he began. We paid our dues. We followed the treaties. We trusted in collective security. When the Keth came for us, we called for help. We called every species we had worked with, traded with, negotiated with for 2 centuries. He paused, letting the silence stretch. No one answered. Not one ship. Not one soldier. You calculated the odds and decided we were not worth the risk. You expressed sympathy and offered nothing else. You left us to die. The council chamber was completely silent. Except the humans, Tallis continued. The species you have spent a century dismissing. The species you call aggressive and primitive and short-lived. They did not calculate the odds. They did not ask what they would gain by helping us. They heard our call and they came. And many of them died. His voice grew stronger. I do not know what kind of species the humans are. I do not know if they are wise or foolish, if they will last 1,000 years or burn out in a century. But I know this. When we were drowning, they jumped in. Perhaps it is time we all learned what that means. On Earth, the surviving crews of the 7th Fleet returned home as heroes. Cities held parades. Memorials were built for the fallen. Vice Admiral Cho Yoonji received the highest military honors humanity could give. Chief Petty Officer Bae Yuna was promoted to ensign and given command of a new marine company. Captain Lee Seung-woo and the crew of the Iron Promise were remembered in a monument that stood in the center of the fleet academy. But the moment that would echo through history came from a simple recording. Lieutenant Yoon Ha-jin, still aboard the damaged destroyer Relentless, received a surrender signal from a crippled Keth ship requesting terms. She was exhausted. Her uniform was torn. There was blood on her face from a wound she had not bothered to treat. She had been fighting for hours. She had watched friends die. She opened the communication channel and responded. This is the Terran vessel Relentless. We accept your surrender. But understand this. If you ever threaten the innocent again, we will come back. And next time, we will not just break your fleet. Her voice was calm, certain, unafraid. We will break your empire. The Keth remembered those words. In the years that followed, they never again attacked a species under human protection. Other empires learned the same lesson. The galaxy began to understand that humans were not just another young species waiting to be conquered or absorbed. They were something different, something dangerous, not because of their technology, or their numbers, or their weapons, because they would fight for strangers. On Valoria Prime, Ambassador Talis had a memorial built near the council hall. It was a simple structure, listing the names of every human who died in the battle. Valorians came from across the planet to see it, to read the names, to understand what those people had given for them. At the base of the memorial, an inscription was carved in both Valorian and English. They heard our call. They answered. And far away, on countless human ships traveling through the stars, crews went about their duties, knowing that somewhere out there, someone might need help. They would be ready. They would always be ready, because that was who they were. That was what it meant to be human. No one stands alone, not while humanity draws breath.